Which Side Podcast is a proud member of the Which Side Media Collective.
This week's episode is brought to you by the Which Side Media Collective. Right now, you can go onto the Which Side Media Collective and grab yourself a vegan Vespa-inspired shirt. They're on pre-sale right now. You can pick them up for $15. They're normally $20, and we only need a few more to get them printed. So get them while they're hot, and get them while they're cheaper. Because who doesn't want to be riding on their sweet scooter and scooting around town, letting everybody know that they're vegan, because the second a vegan walks into a bar, everyone knows that they're vegan because they tell everyone.
Wait, you have to have a scooter to wear it?
No.
Oh, okay, because, I don't have a Vespa because, Lambretta all the way over here.
I have a Prius.
and you're going to wear it too?
Yeah.
Yeah, just whatever you're rocking.
Whatever you're rocking. All that matters is that you have to let everyone know you're vegan when you're vegan, because it's important that everyone knows.
But more importantly than it's the Vespa logo, it's just fucking styling.
And I made it, so, for that reason alone, you should get it.
Ah, damn it. Now I can't wear it.
Well, I made the design. You screen printed it.
That's true. That is true. That's how it works, right?
Yeah, typically.
Head on over to whichsidecollective.org. Get that shit on order, y'all. This is episode 175.
Yeah, this is a lecture that was recorded at the Resistance Ecology Conference in 2015 by Jeff from Burning Hearts Media. So you should check it out. It's presented by Dylan Powell and Amanda Lickers. It's called Anti-Colonialism and Animal Liberation.
Two things we care deeply fucking about. So stick around for that. Hey, Jordan, what news and events do we have going on?
If you're listening to this on the day that it released, Monday the 14th, you can head over to the Salt Lake City Library and write some letters with Anarchist Black Cross. If you're not in Salt Lake City, there's a lot of prisoners that could use your support. If you're looking for some ideas for some people to write, you can always write to Eric King, who is currently needing a ton of support. They're not allowing him vegan food at the moment, so you should call in, definitely demand some vegan food. Also, Kevin Olaf is about to get out, so Kevin could use some love. Write to Kevin as well. We'll have the links in the description. This week's listener shout out comes from Charlotte Malrich. Charlotte said we could shout out whatever we want. Thank you so much, Charlotte. So this week we're going to shout out Burning Hearts Media. We just want to thank Burning Hearts Media for always being so cool. Jeff's always been great and always let us use his stuff whenever we needed an extra lecture or something.
He gets some pretty amazing stuff. If you're not following on Instagram, you totally need to. It's a great thing. He had some pictures from a palm plantation earlier. There are some pretty fucking cool pictures.
He was riding with Sea Shepherd for a while. It's super beautiful stuff. Even got into some really mainstream newspapers with some of his photography. He does photography and videography, and it's just amazing. It's usually centered around social justice issues, so check it out, Burning Hearts Media.
For the slingshot this week, March 15th, 1932, Havana newsboys destroyed editions of their own newspaper in protest of price increases.
Hell yeah.
I did that one for you, you Newsy fan.
I just love how popular Newsy is.
And they don't get it, do they?
No.
If you like these little tidbits of history, pull them out of the Slingshot Personal Organizer. Head on over to your local info shop or an online info shop like AK Press. Go get your shit organized. Has some pretty amazing things in here besides these tidbits. Plus, they don't pay us for this. We just really like them. So, check them out.
I really hope you enjoy this episode.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side? Which side are you on? 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 Which side are you on?
Okay, so Dylan's gonna say some really awesome shit, y'all, to really listen really well. But it's easy because he's white and a man. And then after we're gonna do we're gonna have a conversation. Then you guys get the joy of witnessing it. It's called a fishbowl, and we're gonna just talk about we're gonna develop just talk about tools and actually talk about a practice of anti-colonial and animal liberation, because I feel like our relationship is a great example. So. That's how that's going to go. And so folks can ask questions, and we're going to try and expand a bit on the question that Dylan had asked during the plenary on tools and what are actual strategies, so that way we can give people resources. Because I hate it when conferences don't do that. Anyway, sorry, that's all.
First off, obviously want to thank Jeff for filming. Want to thank all the organizers and volunteers. It's the third year. I remember when this conference was an idea, being banded around by people. I was supposed to come the previous 2 years, but then I flaked out like a jerk, and I almost did this year, but I didn't. I'm really happy I'm here. All the conversations that have been happening, and people have been so great and awesome, and it's really heartening. I am in a stage of severe burnout, so things like this are really nice. I'm also extremely stoked to be on a panel with Amanda, because I love her bluntness, and she's hilarious, and she's been blowing everyone's mind basically all weekend, so it's going to be tough for me to follow that, because she is brilliant. I mean that in every way. But we're going to talk about anti-colonialism and animal liberation, and the things that I want to talk about specifically are settler colonialism and streams of settler colonialism in vegan communities. And I'll give a working definition for people, and we can kind of work on that throughout too. And if people have questions, like I said, feel free to ask. So settler colonialism in vegan communities, what I'm talking about is veganism that either actively acts as an apology or legitimacy for colonialism, or that can be co-opted and used in the same. So veganism that acts as erasure of indigenous people, dispossession and land theft, and that holds up settler veganism as progress. In essence, any conversation on veganism that can be used to serve this purpose if it is not intentionally situated to combat those influences. So I'm not just talking about people in vegan communities who, maybe inadvertently, I'm not just talking about people who overtly are saying that, settlers, European settlers have brought such progress and abundance to this land and veganism is a part of an evolution of that, so therefore we should exist here. But if people are not actively combating those mindsets, you are engaging in settler colonialism in vegan communities. I've written a couple things about this under the title Veganism in the Occupied Territories, and that has come out of basically my own background. I grew up on Haudenosaunee territory, right where the Grand River meets Lake Erie, in a small village called Port Maitland, obviously settled around the 1800s. That land is on the Haldeman Tract, which was granted to Joseph Brant after the war in relation to his loyalty to the British Crown. The dispossession and land theft that has happened just on the Haldeman Tract, which isn't the traditional territories, or isn't just the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, is massive. You're talking about a postage stamp size of 6 miles on either side of a river that runs up miles and miles and miles, and basically now has been reduced to just a tiny reservation, which is 6 Nations of the Grand River. I grew up about 15 minutes away from the reservation, was raised actively to kind of confront and know this history, which was somewhat odd within the rural community that I grew up in.
That explains a lot.
Yeah.
Actually.
If you know my dad, my dad is kicked out of high school in grade 9 for riding his motorcycle through the gym during prom. Not academic, but understands these issues on a different level. And I was raised basically with this knowledge of what it meant to be a settler, what it means to occupy lands, what it means to attempt the practice of being an ally, and all these things, and what treaties are as well. And those things are important. I also, from a very young age, have always been involved in animal rescue because I grew up in a rural area. I just thought everyone rescued turtles and bunny rabbits and cats and dogs. My sister went on to be a vet tech, and I'm a flunky animal liberationist. All of these things, I could never separate. So whenever issues come up about people, either perceived kind of conflicts or when actual conflicts kind of bubble up, it was never I only saw the issue through one kind of lens. I always kind of saw these issues as together, And in 2006, there was a large land reclamation on the edge of the reservation on Six Nations of the Grand River in Caledonia. That was a land reclamation before housing development went up. And this was a massive political issue locally in that area. So this also was like something I was kind of raised around. There were settler militias which were built up around that time. There was a lot of violence from the settler community against people on the reservation, and like I grew up around a lot of anti-native rhetoric, just constant overt racism. That was always struck me as extremely fucked up and very weird. So all those things influenced kind of how I saw these issues. And then locally, when I started to organize within the vegan community in Niagara in about 2007, I started to get involved in organizing things like potluck series. I intentionally brought those issues to that community. There was a potluck of about 100 people. In 2011, I brought Ruby Montour, who's since passed, also John Henhock and Wes Eliot to come up and talk about land reclamation and animal liberation to this vegan potluck. I found out afterwards that multiple people on the board had actually tried to cancel and sabotage that potluck, claiming that it was no longer about animals. I left that organization within a year because of the different solidarity events that were happening in the community between kind of younger activists who were a little bit more coalition-minded, knew a little bit more about anti-oppression and anti-colonialism politics versus an older generation who were completely against it. There was a traditional deer hunt on territory that was protected by treaty in the community, and the settler community, who was fucking pissed off about all these young kids who were talking about this issue that made no sense to them, went out and protested, and it got extremely ugly, like very, very vicious and ugly, and sparked up a lot of overt racism in my community, and it became a big conflict. Basically, they're like settler outrages, like hysteria. Obviously, local corporate right-wing media hopped on, and it became something that, like, all of these things I never really separated, but at that point it was unavoidable. It was like either I was going to address this conflict like within my community and try to be someone who advocated for a different perspective on settler colonialism in my vegan community, or I was just going to be a part of it. There was no like fence, basically. So in relation to this, I start thinking about these issues in this way, and I start talking about them in this way, and you're getting basically a version of a talk that I've given over the last 2 years on this topic of veganism in the occupied territories. One of the most important things that is foundational to anything that I talk about in this topic is the recognition of the fact that cows, pigs, and chickens did not exist on Turtle Island, on this continent, prior to Europeans being here. The animal agriculture system which exists here was brought here by Europeans. When you're talking about this land specifically here that we are occupying right now, cows, pigs, and chickens would not have existed here 200 to 300 years ago. So there is a complete newness to this issue that can be traced back immediately to contact, occupation, and colonialism, which fucking never gets addressed in animal advocacy. We just talk about, write about, and advocate against animal agriculture as if it has existed, it's natural, it has always existed in the state. It's actually extremely new. It was a weapon of war and genocide, and it is also violence against animals. Those things can't be disconnected, and it's really important for people to trace that history all the way back. If we're ever going to get to what the heart of animal agriculture is and animal use within our European colonial societies, we have to trace it back to those boats which came here and started a process of genocide after contact. Thinking about it in those terms, when I like this conference, I still hear people and they're like, oh man, you got to see Cowspiracy, like this great conspiracy. The environmental organizations won't talk about veganism. And it's like, if there's a fucking Cowspiracy, it's that all of this shit is created by Europeans. Like, why do fucking Europeans feel like we have to go into all these communities and to make demands on people and act as if this is a problem of everyone? This is like my ancestors. We not only gain privilege from what happened through that dispossession, but we've normalized it by this complete erasure of not talking about the fact that animal captivities simply did not exist in the way that we know it 500 years ago on this land. That's on us. That's not on anyone else. And why we would ever place focus on indigenous communities for their relationships with animal and the land off of that, just that main point, is fucked up. It's absurd. We have no legitimacy whatsoever to talk about animal use in indigenous communities.
That was good. No legitimacy whatsoever.
Outside of that, also within the localized community that I grew up in, the land that I occupied, the Haudenosaunee of the Grand River, the Haudenosaunee have a long history of growing the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. They're an agricultural superpower prior to contact. Matrilineal society, which had a functioning democracy, or I wouldn't, even beyond that, a consensus model, which is brilliant, which still exists to this day. We destroyed that through our systems of animal agriculture and dispossession. When I was trying to talk to different animal advocates in my community about why protesting this deer hunt in Short Hills Provincial Park, which is the name of the park, was fucked up, we destroyed the ability for the Haudenosaunee people to have food sovereignty. We took their land. They can't grow the Three Sisters in the way that they did. And when Amanda was talking yesterday about treaties made under duress, adding things like hunting rights to treaties were under duress. It was because already those communities were facing food sovereignty issues, and having hunting as a treaty right was extremely important once you see cows, pigs, and chickens obviously take over all the lands which you previously had. That's entirely fucked up. We create scarcity, and then we target communities who still engage in animal use because we've already wiped out any other option that they have for their own food sovereignty. So all of these issues, a lot of times when people are talking about issues of animal use, they're really talking about food sovereignty issues, and they're talking about scarcity, and you can draw a direct line back to power, and that's the most important connection that you can make. Because if you continue to just focus on that isolated community and think that indigenous traditional deer hunting is the issue, you're going to miss all of that. You're going to miss that history. When I also started to think about this, I wanted to think in broader terms. So I'm going to throw out some stats. I was going to write them down, but my handwriting's terrible. 1/4 of all private-owned land in the United States currently is used to graze farm animals. In the United States, reservation land currently occupies 55 million acres, while the amount of land used for animal grazing is 613 million acres. Like, think about that just in terms of perspective of what the system of European settler animal agriculture has done to land, which is irreversible in many cases, and how tied that is to colonialism and dispossession. And we don't talk about it. We talk endlessly about animal agriculture, and we don't talk about that. That's unacceptable. That's 11 times the amount of land in the United States is currently used to just graze captive animals. That's just grazing captive animals, then is recognized as reservation land. That 613 million acre amount also represents, so if I repeated that point, I should have edited this more, but I was watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on a plane. In the Canadian context, where I'm from, reservation land represents 7.5 million acres, while livestock grazing takes up 50 million acres. That means 6.6 times the amount of land is used just for livestock grazing in Canada than is currently recognized as reservation land. In both instances, these numbers represent just the use of land for livestock grazing, as I said, meaning neither represent the massive amount of land in both countries needed for resources to feed, water, house, and turn these animals' flesh and bodies into commodities. From there, looking at stats of captive farm animals in Canada from StatsCan in 2011, there are 12.7 million captive pigs in Canada, 961,000 captive dairy cows, 4.5 million captive beef cows, 12.8 million total captive cattle, 38.6 million captive hens in Canada. Each one of them will obviously represent an individual, while also begging the question, within the span of 500 years, how did this country of Canada come to confine 63 million animals where previously none of these species existed? What is the impact to the land? What is the impact to the wildlife? And what is the impact to indigenous communities who have had to face this system of our agriculture, which was brought here?
Yeah, I actually want to expand on that a little bit. Like in the ways in like where European agricultural systems are being imposed on indigenous territories, like this, like as like Dylan like underscored, like this directly impacts our food sovereignty, but it also like completely like can destroy traditional ways of life. And so like part of the clearing, because of the whole Terra Nullius shit, they're like, okay, this shit's empty. There's no human beings here because like indigenous people are apparently less than human. according to like white supremacist like ways of thinking. But anyway, so like the process of clearing land for cattle in and of itself was like a main motivation in a lot of like the acquisition of new territories and like things like scorched earth campaigns in order to like, and this is like also feeds into the slaughter of the buffalo, as well as like attacking like natural migration patterns of like herding in like semi-nomadic like indigenous nations. So this is like directly impacts like where people like freedom of movement. It directly impacts like cultural traditions and like life ways, our abilities to like subsist off our territories, and also was like a main a main pillar of generating need for new land. You know, so like as more settlers come to settle, they're like, okay, we need to have more food, more livestock, so we need to clear all this new land and push off the natives. So it's like there's this directly reciprocal relationship in the development of captivated animals like who are in industrial farming, like torture, you know, and that development is actually co-constituted by the displacement of indigenous peoples and clearing of our territories.
One of the main reasons why I really think it's central for people to understand the issue in this way is the newness of European settler animal agriculture is its weakness. We just assume that it's naturalized and it's existed forever because it legitimizes our own existence here and it erases indigenous people. But if you're actually looking at ways to dismantle European settler animal agriculture, knowing the fact that it is actually extremely fucking new in this land is a main point to that. So if your interest is actual animal liberation, and you think that you can separate these issues, it's entirely impossible. If you live in occupied land and occupied territories, you cannot do those things. And I think as far as effectiveness goes, being overtly and intentionally against that system, naming that system, and playing an active role is a huge part of that. Outside of this, one of the main reasons why I started to think about these issues is because at the same time, I saw a similar kind of rhetoric coming out of Israel. So kind of the myth of vegan progress in Israel as a way to naturalize and legitimize the occupation of Palestine. And there's conversations which are happening at the exact same time. The way that I try to relay it is like, I remember the 2008 to 2010 span where the biggest kind of discussions and debates, it seemed, in animal rights was welfare versus abolition or some other kind of dumb-framed arguments. And now it's like, are we going to either have a coalition politic or are we just going to go it alone? And the discussion over the myth of progress in Israel is basically the example of Israel being brought back to North America as a way of challenging the coalition politic. So in Israel, people had a really singular focus now, and people are playing this up as if this is a vegan revolution. Therefore, all of this work that's being done, or I shouldn't say all of this work because there's not enough of it being done, but any work being done to bring a message of anti-colonialism or anti-oppression to vegan communities is no longer necessary because it just takes up time, it gets in the way, and all we need to do is just focus on animals. So these conversations are completely tied together. Israel, as the example, obviously is held up against coalition politics. 269 Life, a campaign in Israel, which was kind of born out of Anarchist Against the Wall and other people who originally were involved in anti-apartheid organizing, who basically sold the fuck out, lost their consciences, and just devolved into like neo-fascist animal liberation organizing in Israel. It's extremely misanthropic and it's anti-Palestinian, but it's also being popularized in Israel. And that's what is being exported back. And these conversations are kind of playing off each other. So now that people are starting to talk about anti-colonialism in animal liberation circles because people feel uncomfortable, Israel becomes the example of saying, well, we don't have to even have that conversation. It overturns a long history of Anarchists Against the Wall and veganism in Israel that generally in the 80s and the 90s was anti-apartheid. And there are still obviously lots of people who do radical anti-apartheid organizing and who are vegan in Israel, and I support those things. But right now, the main focus is more 269 Life, non-human first, anti-Palestinian type organizing, and it makes me sick. This coincides with two major Israeli offensives that have killed thousands of Palestinians alongside the everyday occupation that Palestinians live under. So when we talk about greenwashing, it's not a surprise that in between two major offensives into Palestine, the State of Israel, the IDF, and this propaganda machine is coming out with this idea of greenwashing the occupation as the progression or the evolution of Israeli vegan society, or why this would be useful as far as leverage goes. All of this is based on suspicious claims from within this particular vegan community that claim that now 5% of the population in Israel is vegan. That gets repeated, and I've talked to a lot of really angry Zionists who really hate how I write about this issue, and they claim it's more, but there's no way to identifiably look at that, and then also I'll get into reasons why that's fucked up anyways. One of the main things which is so important to understand outside of the fact that it's completely unjust and fucked up to greenwash genocide, regardless. But the factual claims that are being made when people perpetuate this myth of progress and of vegan Israeli communities is that it's completely false. Per capita meat consumption, for which there is hard data, tracks Israel is eating 1.2 kilogram per capita of meat a year. That's there's only a handful of countries in the entire world who eat more meat per capita a year than Israel. And the last year that we have data for is 2012. Americans, unfortunately, you're above them. One of the only ones. You fucking suck. And another thing that's important to understand, meat consumption per capita in Israel in 2000 was 70 kilograms per year per person. So if you actually chart the rapid rise of meat consumption in Israel between 2000 and 2012, their meat consumption rates have actually risen faster than just about any other country in the world. So alongside this overarching narrative that there's fucking vegan revolution in paradise in Israel is the fact that Israelis are eating a fuck ton of meat. It makes no sense. Per capita meat consumption shows how absurd these claims are. We celebrate hyper-industrialized and technical states as the most vegan, even though they consume the most animals. Built in the idea of progress is absurd, but lucrative for people who want to greenwash occupation. Palestinian meat consumption, by comparison, is 25 kilograms per capita per person a year. Lebanon, 43, Egypt, 28, Jordan, 46. We associate strength of the state in advanced technological societies with progress in vegan circles, even though these things almost always relate to higher rates of animal use and animal death. Regulation and laws around animal use are also framed as success. This happens a lot. People will say, oh, this country is the most vegan because they have the most laws pertaining to animal welfare. If you actually did a study of animal use set up against the most amount of regulation or laws of animal use, you would find that it has no correlation whatsoever, and generally is actually the complete opposite. Generally, the countries which are engaged the most in animal use and animal slaughter are the ones that have the most amount of laws and regulation. However, the ones who don't have laws are barbaric, backwards, the regular framing that's racist, right? And Nepal is another example, which I easily could have worked into this, and the Gadami Festival as well. This illustrates how ineffective the animal advocacy movement actually is at bringing numbers down, and how creating small and isolated vegan communities largely has no impact on issues like large numbers of meat consumption. So what I mean when I say that is we have this idea or some people have this idea in animal advocacy commercials or communities. I haven't been sleeping. Is basically like if we grow the largest vegan community possible that we can, we are going to lead one day to a vegan revolution. And most AR conferences, you'll hear people say really dumb things, but in 20 years everyone's going to be vegan. That's not the case whatsoever, because vegan consumerism is inherently exclusionary. It is. But anyways, when people talk about things that way, you realize or understand that these small communities don't have an impact on larger numbers. You recognize that so much of what passes for animal advocacy in North America currently is just entirely ineffective whatsoever. Cyber balkanization is a concept which ties into this, where we create online communities which are basically isolated bubbles. And as long as we track or create kind of a linear growth for them, we think that we're progressing. Veganism as an ideal, and we're not even progressing at really the rate of population growth, and we're still in the margin of error. And Morgan, the one guy from Mercy for Animals forever ago, said we were going to have a vegan North America by 2010. So what held up with that promise, right? It's not happening. So obviously, the way that we frame issues and we talk about issues, we're not getting to the heart of what the problem is. We're just basically creating these small pockets, and because we can eat at Sizzle Pie and Homegrown Smoker and Back to Eden and it's delicious, we think that we're leading somewhere, that overarching at some span of time, throw in an MLK quote, and we're basically going to get there at some point. And it's not going to happen, because the way that we talk about these issues is basically erasing how the power structure actually fucking works. We've created this side narrative of progress where progress does not exist, and we're not challenging power. And part of the main reason for that is that individually, people don't want to address, and I shouldn't say people, I should say Europeans and people who are occupying this land, like myself, they don't want to address how uncomfortable it makes them feel to think about the ways in which you have power and privilege that you're enacting just by existing. And if we can't do that, we will never get to a state of confronting larger systems of power. I've got one last note. Or no, I'm sorry, I've got more. Recognizing these currents, advocates have to be intentional and overt in their denunciation of veganism as greenwashing and veganism as an apology for settler colonialism. Understand that although we create isolated bubbles, our work does not exist solely within them. How we talk about veganism, how we carry out advocacy, and who with, all says something about how we relate to power. If the end point of veganism is an apology for genocide, then creating a vegan culture is pointless, counterproductive, and harmful for animals. And one of the main reasons why I don't even want to publicly talk anymore or even work on growing a vegan community is I don't want the communities that I grow to be co-opted by this fucking bullshit. I'm not going to create another vegan consumer if that's just going to be used as an apology for colonization. And no one else in this room should. That's not fucking working. All the animals which are currently involved in animal agriculture will be slaughtered and they will die, because that is how capitalism works. Veganism, as an ideal, is a prefigurative practice that people take into their lives. And it can be meaningful, but it also has to confront power at the exact same time if it is going to be powerful. So we need to stop with this fucking idea where if we just create one more fucking vegan, then we can go home at night and sleep and think we've done something good for the animals, because we haven't. And I seriously think that the end of veganism will occur as any kind of important or practice of justice if we allow it to be equated with legitimizing Israeli genocide. I can't be more clear on that. That is the death of veganism. That is the death of the ideal of veganism as being a practice of animal liberation, if it is just an apology for Israeli genocide. And I have in bold here plugged the Palestinian Animal League Solidarity in the back, PALS, yeah. I know I talked earlier. There are people within Palestine who are doing this work. There are people within any community where people talk about people being backwards or not progressive towards animals. And because this ethic is shared universally by people who care about animals. So get that in your head and support communities which are actually resisting occupation, support land defenders, support land defense, support the reclamation of land, and help these people as they stand up in their communities. Because that is the only way to get out of this mind frame and this narrative of the myth of vegan progress. Because if not, I'm just going to be here 10 years from now eating that Sizzle Pie, getting my homegrown smoker, and eating my Back to Eden to a room of 80 people. And veganism as a community will not have grown. And we'll be talking about the same shit. So thank you for listening.
How much time is it? Go over the 20?
3:30.
3:30, so we have 25 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go.
Okay. Sweet. I had some thoughts that I was going to respond to, but I forget them now because I'm pretty tired. I'm getting tired, I'm like it's like around people all the time and stuff. It's intense. But yeah. So that was like pretty on point. I learned a lot actually just now about like animal liberation movements and how fucking. I mean, I already knew. I didn't involve myself because I already knew it was really racist. But I'm like, damn, that's just fucked up. That is whack. Yeah, and it's like, okay, and so like one thing that I really appreciate that you just said, because like this is a thing that I've been like talking about a lot lately. One time the U of T students invited me to talk about the divestment, fucking fossil fuel divestment, and I'm like, you guys know who you're asking to talk about this? Like, what the fuck? I called up with the kid in myself. Like, what the fuck? And it was just like, anyway, but it was this cool Palestinian woman who was organizing it, and she was like, no, we want to hear from you because we know what you're going to say. I'm like, oh, okay, you want critical analysis, that's great. But like, anyway, so there's like all this organizing going on in student like communities, and I'm telling them, like, if you guys want to stop the tar sands, just support indigenous people. Like, what the hell are you even doing? Like, don't organize a divestment from fossil fuels in your community. First of all, there was like no consent from indigenous communities about like that as a game plan. It was like, that's a whole other conversation, and like natives are like an afterthought. It's like divestment can be like, Israel is really scared of the BDS campaign, but it's like that's designed by Palestinians first of all, so it's a completely different circumstance. This was like some students, and then 350 like branded it. But like what you just said in terms of like supporting land defenders, like and like linking really specifically the like cows, pigs, and chickens to the process of colonization, and like also like just on the point of veganism, and this is like another thing. I was like, a lot of people tend to like, I mean, I know a lot of my radical friends of color tend to like kind of roll their eyes at white vegans, like not like always, but it specifically just because of like the ways in which, like, as you're talking about, like, these, like, ways that veganism is, like, seen to be, like, this European, like, okay, we're gonna, like, help animals and have this, like, ethical way of being, but it's, like, what communities were vegan, for, like, since time immemorial, like, most, like, veganism is largely, like, comes from communities of color in the first place. And so, like, what does it mean to be, like, you know, and, like, those are conversations, like, that I feel like need to be also present, especially in, like, a white-dominated, like, movement. Like, so, like, why are vegans of color feel, like, I'm assuming that vegans of color probably feel hella isolated and feel, like, a lot of complicated feelings, and being in a white-dominated movement that is, like, about a way, like, that is, like, about, like, a set of ethics that, like, come from, like, brown cultures, you know? So I just wanted to put that out there. And then like, and especially too, like what you were just saying about, you know, like no basis for critique based on like your own relation, like the, you know, your own historical relationships to land and animals, and animal treatment. And like, in terms of like the, so like in terms of like, Haudenosaunee people and hunting, there's, I was just recently reading a book, and it was like an account from Oren Lyons, who is like one of he's Onondaga. He's one of our faith keepers, like in the traditional council, and he was telling a story about hunting. And he said he was like telling a story, and he was like talking about how like he went out with his gun, and he only takes one bullet with him, and on that day he saw 10 deer, and like. You know, there was just different ones. Like one was like a young, like a fawn, you know, like, and like a young lady deer, and like, you know, and he just like had all these hesitations, and just like the moment just didn't come. And then like he was like about to just kind of pack it and go home, and then then this one deer just kind of like ran out and stood in front of him, and just kind of like lifted its like heart open to him and made eye contact, and like he knew like that was the deer. You know, and like we have this we talk about consent, and like the honorable harvest, and like not taking more than you're supposed to, and having relationships with things, and that like understanding that deer giving his life, consenting to that is gonna actually survive. Like, you know, that's gonna feed people, that's gonna keep people warm. Those are like, there's a reciprocity there, and there's a respect, and so he put, you know, so he shot the deer and put down tobacco and acknowledged it. And as Haudenosaunee, we view the deer, we have a lot of like love and respect for deer as the leaders of the forest, you know, so they're the leaders of the animals, because he makes that sacrifice for our families, you know. So yeah, you know, like that's a completely different way of like relating to animals, like as a relative. And there's like actual, like people always say like this thing of like animals can't advocate for themselves. I don't think that's true. I think that animals communicate. You know, I've seen animals that have been saying, don't touch me, don't pick me up, you know, like the domestication. Anyway, I don't want to get into the, like, I'm just like, that's like a whole other conversation. And like who, like, and it's just like also to another thing that kind of annoys me with animal liberation, like, you know, scenes, is like also just like the lack of conversation of like eugenics. like and eugenic origins of like perfecting torture methods that are used like today like against animals and that were practiced by like forced sterilization and all these things like within a context of like colonization and specifically against like Black and Indigenous people, you know. And so like why are these things like not being centered, you know? And so it's like, and like again, so like, you know, what you were saying is like it's not coming back to like the root of the issue. And it's easy to like take these outs because then you don't have to think about your own power and the ways in which like abuse is happening, like to the land and to like various like all kinds of colonized peoples. So yeah, that was like some just like afterthoughts. But I don't want to do that too much because we have like about 15 minutes until the break, or 17 minutes until the break. And we were suggesting, what my idea was that we were going to like have like a fishbowl and maybe just like talk a little bit. Or like I could even just like, you know, start by like just saying some things that I feel like have been good in my like experiences of working with Dylan and like having support from Dylan. But like I feel like there's like a juicy moment here that because it's really funny that like actually like that Dylan is who he is and is doing the organizing and like has been doing like the type of support work that he's been doing, and I am who I am, and it's like he's actually still on my territory. It's like it's so funny. Here we are in Chinook lands talking to you all, so it's like kind of like serendipitous, even though I think Justin K kind of planned it that way, but like resistance ecology folks in general. But I don't know if there's if folks have like specific questions or like that they want to like maybe start for like a point, like as a place to go, or if there's a place that you want to start at. Like I just want to open it up for like people to be like, this is what I really want to see in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah. I'm down with that.
I'd like to hear you talk about exactly, specifically, in what ways people can support Indigenous movements.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the best things to do is fundraise. Yep. Fundraise for, because there's like a lack of like, okay, so there's like always a lack of resources, like constantly, and like also be critical about who you align yourself with. That's actually something that I really want to say. Like as a grassroots person, like I don't get paid to do this work. Well, like resistance ecology is giving me a bit of an honorarium for this, you know, this moment. But like I don't get paid to like support other Indigenous nation struggles. Like I have to find resources for myself in order to be able to do that work. You know, like I don't, like I'm not with an NGO, like I'm unaffiliated except for within my own community as Indigenous people, you know, and also just to be aware. Well, this is more true in Canada because the situation is a little bit more complex in the United States, but like understanding the difference between traditional councils and band councils, or traditional councils and tribal councils. And like a lot of the time there isn't state recognition, and that process is obviously like fraught with issues. But sometimes that is like the only anyway. But like there are always like grassroots youth. There's always young people and like also older folks who have been doing this and are doing this and like need support and need resources. Like if y'all, I think the next time slot is going to be, I think Kanahus is going to be talking about freedom babies and like the work that's going on like in Secwepemc territory, which is not even that far from here, with the Mount Poly spill, you know, and all the things like there's just like so many. So like one thing you can do is follow Reclaim Turtle Island, because then you'll be able to know what's actually happening in terms of Indigenous land defense. Like so like through social media, Warrior Publications is like another space where you're going to be like actually getting information. And then when you're actually hooked into information, you're going to see constantly calls for support. All kinds of different organizations of like grassroots land defenders are going to say like, we need support. We need people to be at corporate headquarters. We need people to be doing like research. We need folks to be fundraising for GoPros and other like editing software so we can have our own media kits, you know, like these types of things. Like think about if y'all gone through action planning, like what does it take to build an action? And those are the things that we need access to. And like, we're able to speak for ourselves, you know, like that's the other thing is like sometimes solidarity can become very co-opting, where people start to like speak on behalf of other people and their experiences. And so you got to find ways to like be uplifting voices of other people instead of centering yourself in your own narrative, you know? And so like, I feel like, so for instance, like Dylan as like a white settler on my territory and as an animal advocate, and like also like organizer for marine land animal defense. Come on, Matt is so cool. They're shutting down marine land, which is like I don't know if you know what that is. He doesn't even talk about his own shit. See? That's good. No. Then you have to have good friends who can say it for you. But, no, but like, and actually, that's fucking cool. I just really think Matt is fucking cool. But anyway, I just want to say that. But like, you know, this like, so like, and like Dylan took the initiative to reach out to Reclaim Turtle Island and say like, these are skills and these are resources that I have. Like, how can I support you? And he's like helped me with social media stuff and like all kinds of different things, you know. And like Dylan also shows up for other movements. Like he also supports migrant justice. You know, like he's like, okay, what axes of power do I like fucking hold, and how can I weaponize that power? You know, and that's like something that like homies over at Talawan Info Shop, Out of Your Backpack Media, and like Indigenous Action Media are always talking about is like weaponizing privilege. How can you, and like this is sort of like maybe the term that we've been kind of liking a little bit is race traitor, you know, as like, you know, like what I like to see is white on white fight, you know, that's what I like to see, you know, it's like, because like it shouldn't have to all of the emotional, like he's like Dylan going to like those spaces like vegan spaces and animal lib spaces and saying like, listen, we need to talk about settler colonialism, we're missing the issues here. We need to talk about white supremacy, we're missing the issues here. That is exactly your job. That is what you should be doing. You need to be dispelling the myths and educating, truth telling. You know, that's a basic, you know, so like it's like information, truth telling, and you have to be able to educate yourself and hold each other critical. And that's part of this like understanding that we're in systems of power, you know, that have taught us to be this way. And so we have to stop stigmatizing criticism. You know, instead of calling out, calling in, you know, calling in I think actually is very different than calling out, and I think calling in is strategic, and for me that's more like we have a shared positionality and like you're doing some fucked up shit, so I'm going to talk to you because you're like my friend and we're relatives. But like I now have been thinking about this idea of critical support, you know, of offering critical support, which is like where you tell people what's up. You know, and like and we need to be able to value that for the labor that it is, you know, because it's a lot of work to undo. Like even as people who experience like even just like, for instance, like I'm sure a lot of like people can relate to like even like sexism or heteronormativity, you know, like even being able to see that shit at first, it takes a while to undo it and peel back the layers, you know, but once you start doing it, things start to sear at you, you know, and things become more visible and become more like palpable. And like that's a process that we need to be honoring and understanding that it takes like time and emotional labor in order to be able to articulate these things, and we need to hold each other to those standards as community, as friends, you know, and as like comrades. And if we want to be effective, like unless people are just doing this to like make out or something, like, you know, like, then why are we here? Because that's the thing. It's going to be, what's your commitment like, you know? And you have to be prepared for these unsettling situations because that's our goal, you know? It's like unsettling, you know, and it's valuable. And like in terms of like this idea of like liberation, these key issues, right? And so like those are like just a few things, you know, in terms of like finding out what access do you have and like educating yourself and calling for your own people, educating your own communities on like the issues and understanding like, and even just like knowing enough to educate yourself enough about like people of color movements, so that way you know when people are doing call outs for solidarity, because we try to blast that shit on social media as much as we can. We're trying to get fucking likes and shares and retweets and reblogs and all that shit, and we want people to like, we have calls for action all the time for global days of action, or like we'll call for like action against specific targets, like and if you guys don't think that like Enbridge pipelines kills fucking animals, like come on, animal liberation is directly tied to resource extraction as well, you know, like yeah, we can clap for it. Okay, yeah. Did you have a question?
Well, I think
or thing to say?
What you said, weaponizing privilege, that's actually the point I was going to make. I've been doing solidarity work with Palestinians on this campus, Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights. And as a person with white European settler privilege, it is not a comfortable process to unsettle myself and understand what that means and constantly check myself. Am I speaking on behalf of somebody? What is my role? What do I use my privilege for? Like, it's a constant process. I don't think you ever arrive. And if we fool ourselves into thinking that we do, you know, my partner is a man of African descent. My daughter, identifies as a queer person of color. I have many Palestinians. That does not mean I have even begun to figure it out. Mm-hmm. What that means is I have to constantly remind myself of what can I do to weaponize that privilege. I mean, I've been using, the term use your privilege for good, but I actually think that's even more powerful. The reason why I'm speaking up right now is because I just came out of a conversation with my partner and another Indigenous person, and they are echoing what they've been saying to me and other white people in this community that have the settler privilege that we do. What they keep saying is, we need to talk to other white European people because they will listen to us. That is the privilege that we have. They are very tired. They get tired of having to explain to other people, other white people, you know, white supremacy, how it works. It's like, I'm tired of having that conversation. My daughter's been telling me that for, you know, I give her all the credit because she's like, my job is not to make you comfortable. So that's the first thing we have to understand. These conversations are very uncomfortable, but people of color, Indigenous people, have been uncomfortable for this society tells them every day, this place is not for you. You know, go away, we don't want you, push them off to the side. And so like we have to, like, these conversations that have happened this weekend are probably what needs to happen and continue to happen. And if you're a conscious person, again, realizing you haven't arrived at the end point of like, I understand all the privileges I have. I have cis privilege and white privilege, and I'm the most knowledgeable person. It's like just the beginning of humbling yourself and being like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? What is the best way I can support these people? And they're shouting it from the rooftops. And when, as a white person, when you see another white person interrupting a person of color, and we have to, like, they call it, what do they call it? Interrupting. There's a whole class they teach at PSU, right? It's incumbent on me as a person with the privilege that I have to call another person with those same privileges. Because it's not incumbent on a person of color or Indigenous person when they, you know, it's actually, I found it to be more powerful because they're not expecting it from me. When I sat out here tabling 3 years in a row with the Palestinian flag, it was like the curiosity factor. At first I was pissed off. I was like, well, I'm a human being. I care about human rights because they would always question me. And I was like, okay, so this is very interesting. And so then I started to question what my role was. But it's sort of like, that's the power. We've got to use it in a way that's constructive and helpful to people who are dealing with oppression and marginalized constantly. You know, I mean, I see the look on his face every morning he gets up. And the stress of having to deal. He works for the union. He's the only male of color in that whole entire union, and he holds a position of power. But he has to deal with racism on a constant basis, and then he has to get up and do it all over again. You know, I used to watch my daughter, and she's like, you're my mother, but you have never walked in my shoes. You do not understand or begin to understand how it feels to be me, even though I'm your blood. And I'm like, oh. Because I've heard mothers of, you know, mixed children, mixed racial children, think they have it all figured out, and that doesn't give me any kind of extra special set of knowledge. And so I just, you know, I figure the best we can do is, you know, I hate calling out or whatever the best terminology is, you know, I was actually going to come up and talk to you about that. It's like, you know, I'm even going to be talking, we're doing some ally work with the All African People's Revolutionary Party here in Portland, trying to, the term ally is used over and over again, but at least, you know, what role can we help play to help facilitate your work better? And the thing I have to go to them and say, we need to talk about, we're on Indigenous land, we're settlers on Indigenous land, and so if we're not connecting those two things, just like I do Palestinian solidarity work, but if I don't connect to what's happening here and try to support that, then it means nothing. So, but, you know, I always say if I'm uncomfortable, that's the beginning of me understanding a little bit more.
Yeah.
So sit with that. And the last thing I'll say, don't take anything personally. It's not about you. You're asking them what you can do and you don't like the answer, well, that's too effing bad. Sorry, that's just the way it is. So when you find yourself getting uncomfortable, sit with it and think about why am I making this about myself? Why do I always have to be like, you know, yes, I got up and spoke second after this woman, but I feel like this is really important stuff, so I'll stop talking, but thank you.
Yeah.
A couple of things, just things that have been brought up and mentioned. Like it's really one thing that's important for people to think about too is like as a concept, as a white European settler, like you just don't know those experiences. You won't understand the complexities, and that doesn't mean you should stop trying, but simplify these issues in your mind to a point where that you can actually be helpful. Land and listen. Land and listen. Keep fucking saying that in your head over and over again. Because land is what ceremony comes from, what food comes from. It is, as a political concept, the most important. Understanding why it's important to support land reclamation, to support land defense. Those two things are critically important for especially white Europeans to understand. And that means anytime people are out on the land, they're being criminalized or they're defending the land, you need to be supportive and listen, because every single time there's a call out. Every single fucking time. There will never be an Indigenous blockade that only puts a call out to other Indigenous people and says, at least, send these materials or money or funds. It's always going out to everyone. So listen for it, because it's happening all the time. Another thing which I will say, which I didn't bring up, which I think is extremely important, especially within current movements in the animal rights community as people start talking about these issues, is there's a really big problem with tokenization. Now that people are starting to become uncomfortable with these kind of ideas, there's this search for can we find an Indigenous vegan person who will be against the seal hunt? Can we find an Indigenous vegan person who will be against this practice which we're comfortable with? And those people are being given platforms. They're being given interviews. They're being given space. And it's tokenizing. It's extremely tokenizing. And the whole process is just made to make people feel comfortable. And again, we won't be actually confronting power in those situations. And that's not just Indigenous communities. That's across the board. There's a huge problem with tokenization within our communities, where critical voices are completely shut out, and where people who will say the things which we want them to say, or which make us feel more comfortable and are less challenging, will be given more platforms. So as organizers of the conference, it's a fucking amazing thing that people don't do that here. That's one of the greatest things about resistance ecology, is those types of people don't find space here, and the people who do challenge people do find space. So take that with you into your own communities, but land and listen. If you need to just hear a mantra, that's it. I guarantee you that will be serviceable in 90% of your interactions.
I think you should talk about that.
Which one?
Sameness versus difference.
This is my next talk.
It's really
for people who are not.
I'm gonna talk about it right now. It just pisses me off.
For people who are not going to be in the next panel, or if Amanda
who's
wants
not going to be in the
about
next one?
The next one that I'm doing, coalition building, animal advocacy, and coalition building with Lauren and Ellis. Okay, a couple people.
Okay, most people are not.
Yeah, there's just a concept of understanding sameness versus difference. Within the animal rights community, we have this huge problem with erasure. So we'll go into communities that's Black Lives Matters, and we show up with a one struggle, one fight banner. That's erasure. You're no longer talking about what the issue centrally is about. You're making it about your own issue, and by doing that, you're making it about whiteness. You're making it about what's comfortable for you. And a lot of times when things I remember the I Am Trayvon Martin campaign started up in social media, these things will happen, and you'll have white people who will don hoodies and have a bag of Skittles and take a photo and be like, I am Trayvon Martin. It's no, you're not. You will never be Trayvon Martin. That's fundamentally the problem. You're not going to get it if every single thing is made about sameness. It's about difference and respecting difference and understanding that is a place for power, for us to come together, to actually join together and fight. It's not about being the same whatsoever. Amanda is amazing, but I don't need to know about ceremony and everything that is Haudenosaunee in order to show solidarity, because she comes from a different place and she's different from me. And that's cool and it's fine, because we can still be friends. People who are doing Palestinian solidarity, who this happens all in any kind of community, allied community, and then people just start to adopt those identities because it's about sameness, but that's erasure. If you are erasing the differences that exist between a privileged position and an oppressed position, that's about erasure. You're not fundamentally dealing with the problem. You have to own it. I'm going to be a white boy for the rest of my life. I have to own it, especially if I want to exist in these spaces and have any kind of legitimacy. Nothing is going to change that. I can't wake up tomorrow and say, well, I think I'm 1/16th Haudenosaunee, and I just get my status card. That's not how you deal with these issues, fundamentally. So, yeah, sameness versus difference, it comes up constantly. And every single kind of anti-oppression or social justice movement. And if you can understand that point fundamentally, it will be so much easier to communicate. As a lot of times people will think that it's just kind of well-intentioned ignorance. Let's go to Pride with a bunch of Mercy for Animals leaflets. And it's LGBTQ kids are fucking beaten, killed, commit suicide in this fucking space at a ridiculous level. Why do you have to go and erase that pain and that struggle for justice and make it about you because it makes you feel more comfortable? Just go there and honor that fucking struggle. It doesn't need to be about sameness. And that doesn't mean that one oppression is fucking more superior than the other, or that we need to battle for resources and everything else. No. We just need to recognize we come from different spaces and use that as a critical point to build together.
So you mentioned the seal hunt, and I'm wondering, so mainstream organizations that organize against the commercial seal hunt and against the fur industry are racist as fuck, right? They don't acknowledge indigenous right to hunt, to trap, and they don't acknowledge the occupation on indigenous land. So there are a lot of organizations that try to combat commercial fur and the commercial seal hunt without stepping on the toes and without disrespecting indigenous cultures, but I don't feel like that is done well enough, like myself included, and I'm wondering how we can be better at combating like the capitalism, like white capitalism of those industries, while still like respecting indigenous land, indigenous practices.
So like in terms of the seal hunt, you know who's against the commercial seal hunt? Inuit people.
Yes.
Like, right? So like just fucking align yourself with indigenous people. Like and like they, you know, and like it's just like, I mean, that's the thing, so I don't know if you guys probably, especially because most people are Americlan, so you probably haven't heard of Tanya Tajik, but she's like she's Inuk and she's a throat singer. She's really awesome. And she's also, so she's indigenous and she's a mother, and she took a photo. She had just like hunted like a little seal and it was her baby beside the seal, and she was like, I'm gonna make like this amazing like clothing for my baby. And like because seals, they're like, you know, there's this synergy between those people. Like if it wasn't for seals, like Inuit people wouldn't survive, you know, like how Kanahus was talking about the salmon and how I'm talking about like deer, you know, like there's this like really sacred and like really ancient relationship between these living beings. And Tanya like experienced like from that tweet like so much racism. Are you gonna pull some up?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you were gonna pull some up as an example. But like so much racism happened there, you know, like, and she had death threats, rape threats, people threatened to kill her child. And at first she was just like, fuck this shit, but then it just kept going, you know? And like, so to me, it's just like, this shows like that it's like, okay, you want to stop the commercial seal hunt. Like, first of all, that is a good conversation, is stop the commercial seal hunt. Because the reason that seals' lives are endangered and their populations are threatened is not because of indigenous people who are practicing, like traditional, like an honorable harvest. It is because of colonial capitalism and the notion of like unlimited growth and constantly devouring everything, you know? And so like, these are like a basic anti-capitalist, a basic anti-colonial understanding, like integrated into an animal liberation politic would mean that like in order to stop the seal hunt, the thing that's going to be the commercial seal hunt, the thing that's going to be the most strategically valuable is aligning with Inuit people, you know, and like helping them and like in the ways in which that they're asking for support, you know. And so those, like, you know, these are things because like it's directly attacking Inuit as people as well. Hunting the seals is also hunting Inuit people because it is their way of life, you know, and it's like forces like urbanization where we have to leave our homelands, or even reservations, like there's like all these like resort, like we can't subsist as we did before, and so we're forced to be urbanized, you know, and so land grab, it becomes easier. And guess what? The Ring of Fire, you know, like there's like all these like major Canadian mining corporations that want to like open up in all of these areas that, especially now thanks to global warming, like a lot of like the ice sheets are melting back, you know, so there's like even more like resources that are like being unearthed, you know, in this way. So like that to me, like it's like these are the ways in which you need to be integrating in your strategic minds, is like intersecting targets, you know, and like ways in which like what is a good way to align yourself in a struggle that's already in a way being waged, you know, like and often most directly, like in terms of like, I mean, I definitely do not want cows like eating off of pastures that are where my ancestors have been exhumed in order to like create flat land for them, because that is unnatural in my territories. Okay, like these are things that as indigenous sovereigntists, like we don't want. We also don't want like downstream contamination from like factory farms either, you know, or the ways in which like these things bioaccumulate. And like for those of us who can still practice like Three Sisters growing, you know, like corn absorbs heavy metals. It's actually a bioremediator, but that is actually not good if you don't know that and you're eating the corn, you know. And so like these things are connected; they're not separate. And there was one other little thing I was thinking about. Oh yeah, and like the fact that Tanya and Tajik like experienced so much racism, like from people who consider themselves like, who are probably more like liberal, but they're like we're animal liberationists, we're animal advocates, we're animal, you know, we're down for animal rights, and like then they are actually threatening rape, threatening murder against indigenous women and her child. You know, like this is the level of white supremacy and racism that exists. And like this is the amount of education, you know, and like it's harder because when you start to have really practice the politic of intersectionality, you notice your affinity tends to get smaller and smaller, you know. But like in terms of your groups, your size, your numbers. But it doesn't have to be that way, because I feel like these conversations are happening and there are people who are like actually committed enough, you know. And like that's why I was saying, you know, I think it was yesterday about, you know, there's a conflict of interest. You know, there's a conflict of interest when you benefit from the same systems of power that are putting animals' lives like in danger, you know, to really understand what is it going to take to destroy that system of power, because it means that your life is going to be different too. You know, and so those are things that people need to ask themselves, and like, how can we support, you know, like, I feel like we outlined a lot of different ways for starting points, you know, and like for folks who are already like in the midst of it, like I'm open to like have conversations, like contact me like via Facebook or like, you know, the internet and stuff, and we can chat on the phone, because I'm always down with like putting, you know, even though I'm like also hardcore and badass, you guys think, I'm actually down to invest resources in things that are going to be reciprocal. You know, if I feel like I can help make someone more dangerous, then I will, you know. And I know that a lot of other folks are like that too. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. If there's any other questions, it's pretty much the break is over. Do you have anything else to say?
I'd add like some resources for people who are trying to think about this issue. One of my favorite sites, my favorite writers, I can't give his name because he's a high school teacher and he writes critical stuff that could lose his job, but Be Still Oblivion. There's 2 essays. One is Shooting an Elephant, and it deals specifically with Gary Yourofsky and with the occupation of Palestine, and it's amazing. The writing is awesome. Another essay is called Cats on Turtle Island, and deals specifically with this issue where like white Europeans see like speciesism and animal liberation through a lens of like animal use as being the central form of oppression instead of colonization. So it's like until we switch those frames, like you're going to have those problems. And I have those discussions a lot with calling out like larger nonprofits and talk to directors, and it's a constant struggle. And it's on us. Like we got to mobilize together in a way that confronts these people so that they change their tactics. Doing the work of like fighting against the seal hunt in those communities or against the Haudenosaunee, like you're doing the state's work. Like the state wants nothing more than a weakened like northern communities so that they can move in with their resource extraction projects. They intentionally attempt to keep those communities as marginalized as possible, and we're just adding to it. And it does nothing to help animals, because once there's larger resource extraction projects that are in there, those changes will be irreversible and they will kill more animals. It just makes absolutely no sense why people would really focus on that. And there was one other thing in my mind, and I think I lost it. Oh, there's a great comic as well for people who are looking for background. The title of the comic is Dogs, Comic History of Colonialism, and it details the relationship that Inuit seal hunters had with dogs and with the arrival of the RCMP in the 1950s as in relation to the Cold War in the North, and how they systematically just killed an insane amount of dogs to try to stop seal hunting and try to force food assimilation on people in the North. And we're basically still dealing with those policies. So when people go into communities like, oh, you shouldn't seal hunt, this person shouldn't seal hunt, like this has a long history, and it's tied to starvation, it's tied to death, and it's tied to genocide. So it's not like a flippant thing. This is very serious. People need to treat it that way.
This week you heard.
The Lurch by Two Lone Swordsmen.
Right now you're listening to.
Best Friends by Eliot, Lipp.
Hey, just wanted to give a shout out to Psych Meg. They gave us a iTunes review that said, "This vegan gives Which Side 2 thumbs way up." Thanks. Plus, I want to give another shout out to nbsp, who gave us this review on iTunes. I was looking for something as entertaining and informative as Crime Thinks Ex-Worker podcast, and this show definitely hits the mark. The Which Side podcast has helped me make the decision to go from vegetarian to vegan. Keep it up, guys.
That's awesome.
No,
Congrats.
You know what? You keep it up. Like,
Yeah,
seriously.
that's super cool.
That is way awesome. If you want to help support the show, go give us an iTunes review. It helps us a ton.
If you don't have a smartphone, would that mean you have a stupid phone? If you're not yet our friends on social media, you should be our friends. Like us. Follow us. Friend us. Whatever the equivalent is. We talk about things pretty much every day on the social media that we don't talk about on the show. So, be our friends. The person who sends us the funniest cute animal video, I'll hook you up.
Dude, I watched a video of Panda being some big old jerks.
Pandas can be jerks, but they're so adorable.
Dude, you know pandas are pretty violent, right?
Only if you mess with them.
Did you hear about the panda that walked in the bar in New Jersey last week?
Oh, that's awful. I heard about it,
Yeah, crazy, right?
Uh-huh. If you want to hear the rest about that panda, follow us on social media.
We do dad jokes sometimes.
Yeah, it's true.
Is this where we do the end thing?
I think so.
Okay. Oh, I thought you were gonna. Thought you were gonna do
I
it.
don't fucking know what shit. Damn. Fuck shit down. I was gonna say I don't know what damn shit to say, but that's not the right order.
Which Side Podcast is hosted and produced by Jordan Halliday and Jeremy Parkin of the Which Side Media Collective, with web design by Jordan Halliday and sound design by Jeremy Parkin. Booking by Mari Halliday. Theme music by Commandantes. Go to whichsidecollective.org to check out the other shows in the collective. As always, fuck shit damn.